Welcome, everyone. My name is Trish Secca, and I'm a Senior Nutrition Program Manager here at IFINS. We're happy to have you here today and to offer you this webinar focused on the sodium reduction challenges and opportunities in food service. For those of you that are new to IFINS, or the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, we are a nonprofit organization that advances food and nutrition science for the benefit of public health. And we do that by bringing together scientists from industry, government, and academia. Our core values are illustrated on this slide, and they guide everything that we do. Scientific integrity is centered on transparency, and we actively seek and enable collaborations, and all our work must benefit the public. IFINS mobilizes our membership from government, academia, and industry to drive, fund, and lead actionable science in the areas of food safety and nutrition to advance public health. We catalyze the creation of scientific knowledge by funding external researchers and convening experts to support positive change, and our collaborative and inclusive structure empowers members to bring forward the diverse perspectives of the entire food and beverage ecosystem, and we are committed to scientific integrity and transparency. And if you'd like more information about our organization, you can go to ifins.org. This webinar is specifically brought to you by the IFINS Sodium in Foods and Health Implications Committee. The committee focuses on the development and communication of sodium research on foods, food patterns, and health implications. And specifically, the content is part of the committee's efforts to facilitate stakeholder dialogue on sodium intake in the context of total diet, and to communicate the need to accelerate progress with sodium reduction across the food supply. Before we get started, I'd like to cover how to ask questions. This is the first format that attendees may see on their meeting interface. Starting at the top, you'll notice an orange arrow. This arrow allows you to expand or collapse the control window on your screen. When this window is expanded, you can type in your comments and questions. And in fact, we encourage you to participate this way in the dialogue. The questions are only visible to the IFINS staff and not other attendees. This is the second format that the online attendees might see. Again, you can enter questions right where the question mark is at any time during the presentation, and IFINS staff will ensure that questions from the audience are addressed at the end of the webinar. We wanted to inform everyone that today's webinar is approved for 1.5 CEUs by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, as well as 1.5 CEs by the Certifying Board for Dietary Managers. And a link will be shared with participants after the webinar so everyone can access the evaluation and CE certificates. With that, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Dr. Robin McKinnon and Casey Hines, who will be our first speakers today. Robin McKinnon is a Senior Advisor for Nutrition Policy at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Dr. McKinnon works to advance FDA's nutrition initiatives across CIFSCAN, including FDA's sodium reduction efforts. Prior to joining FDA, Dr. McKinnon was a health policy specialist at the National Cancer Institute. At NCI, Dr. McKinnon led policy-relevant research activities on diet, obesity, and physical activity. She has a PhD in public policy and administration from the George Washington University and a master's in public administration from Harvard University. Joining Dr. McKinnon is Casey Hines, who is the monitoring team lead working at FDA CIFSCAN, where she oversees post-market analysis and monitoring of the U.S. food supply and leads the team working on FDA's National Sodium Reduction Initiative. Prior to joining FDA, Casey was the manager of nutrition programs at a communications firm working with leading food and nutrition companies, where she oversaw the development of scientific programs and managed a laboratory at the National Institutes of Health. Casey received her Master's of Science degree in nutrition from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'd like to welcome both Robin and Casey. Robin, we need to unmute.
Okay, that has never happened, Trish, you know, in the history of webinars. Why don't I go back and say thank you so much for the opportunity to join today. As Trish mentioned, I'm Robin McKenna, Senior Advisor for Nutrition Policy at CEPSAN Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and I'll be joined by my colleague Casey Hines. And we're so glad to have the opportunity to join today. So in September of 2022, just last year, was the second only conference, the first in over 50 years, held by the White House on hunger, nutrition, and health. And at that conference, there was a national strategy that was issued with the aim of ending hunger and reducing diet-related disease and advancing health equity, all by 2030, with very much a focus on whole of government, whole of society approach. Within the national strategy and framing the conference as well as the strategy, there were a number of FDA initiatives that were highlighted, particularly in the Pillar 3. So these 5 pillars that framed the conference. And within this Pillar 3, empowering all consumers to make and have access to healthy choices, sodium reduction in particular is highlighted. And there are several commitments in there related to sodium reduction from FDA, but also across the federal government, including the Administration for Community Living, which manages and runs the Senior Nutrition Assistance Program, the VA, also the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and also the USDA. So helping to bring all of the tools across the federal government to bear on helping to reduce sodium reduction, or helping to reduce sodium intake. And let me explain why reducing sodium is so very important. And just to orient you to this slide, if you look about 2/3 of the way down, you'll see numbers and a 0 all the way across. And above that line, above the 0 line, is the percentage of the population that exceeds daily recommended limits for sodium by age and by sex. And so what you can see at a glance is that across the board, for all ages, both sexes, 90% of the population, sometimes more in these individual groups, exceed daily recommended limits for sodium. And that has really important health implications because excess sodium increases risk for hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and more. And so you see that the increased risk for hypertension across the US adult population, almost 50%, about 45% of all adults have hypertension, and in African Americans, that number rises to almost 60%. So all in all, over 100 million American adults have hypertension, and that increases risk for death and disease from cardiovascular disease. Over 800,000 people have died in 2019, 2020 from heart disease and stroke. So every year, this is the #1 killer, the #1 cause of death in the US, even throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And in addition to health, of course, there are severe economic consequences as well. So this is not just, this is not only adults, but even among children. 1 in 10 children and 1 in 8 teens has elevated or high blood pressure, putting their health at risk. And I imagine actually that everybody joining today has been impacted in some way by heart disease and stroke, either directly or with a family member or a close friend. So this is personal for a lot of people. And we know that almost half of the population in the US is looking to reduce their sodium intake. As we saw in a recent survey that we did, the Food Safety and Nutrition Survey in 2019, you can see here 47% of the population looking to limit their sodium, and we saw that also our CDC colleagues have found similar results. So we know a lot of people are looking to reduce their sodium, but it's very challenging with our current food supply, and this provides a little information more on how that is. So you see the pie chart here the sources of total intake of sodium, the yellow part of the pie chart is added outside the home. Some is inherent to food, but the small slices of the pie are the sodium sources that are under the control of consumers. So either added in cooking or added at the table. And so relatively small sources that are directly controlled by consumers. So even the most motivated, and we know that almost 50% of people are looking to limit their sodium, even if you're very motivated, it's still very challenging because most of the sodium that we take in the US is already present in the food. So it's challenging. And we know, even though a number in industry have been making strides in reducing sodium, and we're very grateful and glad for those efforts, still more can be done. We know that it's possible to reduce sodium in processed and prepared foods when you look at the international experience, and when you also look at some of the examples here in the US as well. So this is one example of a product that we've anonymized, but looking at this is essentially the same product that is sold internationally. And you see in the US, so there's about 750 milligrams per 100 grams of sodium in this chip product, but then in other countries, very varied sodium levels, so ranging from as low as 332 in Australia, for instance. So this is the same product, sold internationally, very different sodium levels. And then here, another example here in the US, looking at the category of white bread. And this is something that's provided in our guidance or as part of the materials that we make available from our FDA website. But what you see here is across the x-axis down below, this is the concentration of sodium that varies. And this is on the y-axis, the number of products. And what you see is that this is the top 80% selling white bread products in the US from 2010. And about the average, most number of products is right in the middle there, around 500 milligrams per 100 grams, but very wide variability. So ranging from under 200 milligrams to over 800 milligrams, or almost 800 milligrams. So very wide variation, even in top selling products that are sold here in the US. So we know that reductions are possible. And when you look at some of the efforts that have been made internationally, you can see that almost 100 countries have sodium reduction initiatives in place. Many of those are looking to intervene in the food supply itself, and 48 have voluntary targets. Canada and the UK are examples of where they have implemented voluntary sodium reduction targets. Canada first in 2012, they now they're on their second iteration of targets that were issued, the most recent version in 2020, and the UK has published 5 iterations of their voluntary targets starting in 2005. And what they've seen is reductions in Canada in sodium intake, and in the UK looked at not only reductions in sodium intake, but also decreases in terms of mortality from stroke and also heart attacks. 40% reduction in heart attacks between 2003 and 2011. And so in October of 2021, we issued voluntary sodium reduction targets. And to speak more about that, I'll hand over to Casey, and I'll just continue to advance the slides.
Thank you so much, Robin. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Great. Okay. So as Robin mentioned, in October 2021, we issued our final guidance with voluntary sodium reduction goals. And the guidance provides targets for sodium reduction in processed, packaged, and prepared foods. Next slide. With this initiative, we are taking an iterative approach, with this just being the first step so that we can gradually reduce sodium over time. The current targets are for 2.5 years out from when we issued the guidance in October of 2021, which brings us to March 2024. And the guidance contains targets for 163 food categories. The reason that we have so many categories is because we carefully considered the role of sodium in foods, knowing that each category has different considerations. And we know that the role of sodium is different across those categories, and that sodium can be important to things such as safety and preservation or functionality and so forth. So we're approaching this gradually to best enable a level playing field, also to support flexibility and to allow consumer palates to adjust over time. We hope to reduce sodium to 3,000 milligrams per day from the 3,400 milligrams per day that is the current average. And we do plan to monitor the food supply, also evaluate progress and reduction over time, and continue to engage with stakeholders and potentially issue additional rounds of targets as shown in the visual here on the slide. Next slide. Robin flashed this slide on the screen earlier, but what this is representing is one of our categories that we developed, in this case, white bread. And it's representing 2010 data, so it shows the variation of sodium found within white bread in 2010, which was our baseline year. And you can see the number of products on the y-axis and the sodium content on the x-axis in milligrams per 100 grams. We use this information to inform how we could establish targets. So the red line, you could click, thank you, represents the baseline sodium mean for the category as a whole. We are encouraging industry to get to the green line, which is the short-term target for the category. And then we also hope that no products in the category will go above the blue line, which we are calling the upper bound. Next slide. Overall, in the guidance, we have 16 overarching food categories, and some categories are just for packaged food, some are just for restaurant food, and many categories are for both packaged and restaurant foods. So this example for white bread shows how many products we had available from our data sources for both packaged and restaurant foods. You can click to advance and click again. And so for packaged food, we worked with the top 80% of selling products. For restaurant food, we worked with data that was available for the top 100 US chains. Also on the right of this slide is an example of our description for the white bread packaged food category. We did make histogram plots for all of the categories, which are available on our website, and I'll show you where you can find that a little bit later. Next slide. So this slide is showing some additional examples of the sodium distribution for certain categories that are restaurant categories. We had received some comments about how individual component categories related to mixed food or meal type categories. And in both component and meal type categories, we took a consistent approach by working with data available on packages or on menus, as well as sales data to understand the sodium distribution for different categories. Because we don't have information about specific formulations of meal type categories, it was not possible to look more deeply at how both component and meal type categories related, but we do welcome any feedback, data, or information for consideration about how we could establish categories and targets at any time. So we always welcome that feedback. Next slide. This is our website. So you can see on the top left, fda.gov/sodium reduction is where you can find the information about our guidance. And there's a link that if you click again, I think it'll point to the guidance for industry. So when you click this link, it'll bring you to the bottom of the web page, which will take you to where you can actually find and read the guidance. So that first link is the guidance itself, and the next two links present the target table with all of the numbers. So the category descriptions, the baselines, and the targets will be presented in those tables, and that's the same table presented in two different formats. If we jump to the bottom, you can see that the data for the histograms is shared also on the website. It's called Sodium in the U.S. Food Supply for Products in 2010. And the additional references that are shown here are documents that would allow you to read more about some of the methodology that we took to establish the categories, baselines, and targets. in particular reference 5, and then some additional information about some of the food safety considerations that we looked into. Next slide. This is a snapshot example of our target table. It might be a little bit small to read here, but in this table, P is representing packaged and R is representing restaurant. So we present the food category name, of course, the description for that category, and then all the columns to the right there are representing the first two columns that are sharing information about sample size. So the number of products that we had available, as well as the number of restaurants that we had to work with. The next column is the weighted mean for the category. So the 2010 baseline itself for the category. And then the last two columns on the right are the actual targets. And we had two forms of targets, as I kind of mentioned before when sharing the information about the white bread. So we had the category mean or category average, and then the short-term target, which was called the upper bound, is kind of a maximum for that category, such that no product would go above that level. Next slide.
Yeah, and so maybe I can take over from here. Thanks, Casey. And so lots of great information on the website, too much to go into here. But I want to be sure to mention some of the other initiatives that we have at the FDA. I mentioned in the White House National Strategy, there are other efforts across federal agencies, but at FDA, we've also taken additional action. So in 2020, issued an enforcement discretion guidance for an alternative name for potassium chloride, allowing the term potassium salt, which we know potassium chloride is a key tool in sodium reduction in many instances. And we've seen instances of potassium salt now in the marketplace. Also, there's menu labeling, the calorie labeling requirements that were implemented in 2018. Additional information can be requested, or should be available on request. In addition to the calorie information, that additional information available on request should include sodium information. We've mentioned and shared publicly that we're working on a proposed rule on standards of identity related to the use of salt substitutes in standardized foods. So those are foods for which there are standards of identity, so potentially allowing some flexibility in the use of salt substitutes in those standardized foods. And then also recently we issued a proposed rule and received comments. Thank you to everybody who submitted comments to that proposed rule, and that was related to the updated criteria for the nutrient content claim healthy, which includes, among other things, but proposed limits for sodium within that. So a range of activities. We're looking to do what we can to help facilitate sodium reduction across the food supply, both at FDA and working with federal partners and working more broadly. So with that, I will end there and hand back to you, Trish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. Our next speaker today is Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer is a Senior Director of Nutrition Communications at Compass Group. Jennifer is a registered dietitian and the Senior Director of Nutrition Communications for Envision Group, Compass Group's support and visionary team. Envision Group is shaping the future of food service with its focus on business growth and leveraging strategic partnerships. Envision Group ensures the industry leader remains on the cutting edge of innovation, making it easy to do the right thing by promoting well-being of people and planet while driving commercial results. Through her work with Envision Group, Jennifer develops nutrition and wellness programs that are implemented in thousands of locations throughout the U.S. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Trish. So Trish has given me the simple task of explaining how the food service sector operates and how we can tackle the issue of sodium reduction in the food service sector. So I'm going to give that a shot and we'll see how that goes. So to get us started, I thought I'd talk a little bit about where we eat. So I know Robin mentioned the kind of percentage of sodium that is coming from outside the home. So where is that coming from? So when we're eating out, as you see here, there's a variety of places that might happen. So restaurants, I think, are probably the most obvious thing that we think of, but they make up about half of the eating out occasions. You'll also see places like retail food service, which can include getting food at grocery stores that's already prepared for you to eat. Education, so schools, colleges, university, workplaces, hospitals, senior living, a variety of places, stadiums. So it's a complex system within the food service industry, but there are some consistencies there and some opportunities where we can tackle this. And, this is probably a simplistic view of how that food gets to those places and how it ends up on our plates. But I think it does show an important aspect that some of you probably got a preview of during the COVID pandemic, when we had all of these supply chain disruptions and restaurants closing, and suddenly there was a spotlight shown on this parallel kind of food pathway. So obviously we know food needs to be grown and produced and packaged and then distributed to eventually get to the customer. But the way it gets there, it actually goes through two very distinct paths. And so if you're shopping for your home food, you're going to go to a traditional retailer, you're going to buy your groceries, you'll bring them home, you'll prepare them, and then you'll obviously enjoy them. In the food service world, we have our own path. It's parallel. There's some crossover, but a lot of it is unique. And I bring this up, and I'll talk about this a bit in our piece about opportunities and challenges, in that the food that someone sees in a grocery store or new products that are developed that you may see in the retail environment aren't necessarily the same products, nor are they necessarily prepared in the same places or distributed through the same means as you would see in the food service industry. And this poses a few challenges, one including data. We had this conversation around kind of the FDA's assessment of where we're getting our nutrients and where the sodium's coming from. There are some gaps here in understanding actual nutrient information in this parallel path. But I think there's been some progress there, and we'll have some movement there. But it is two distinct pathways. And so how we address the challenge of sodium reduction in the food service industry is a little bit different, because it's not chefs running out to the grocery store and choosing from 10,000 products that might be on the shelves. It is a different system here. So let's go through a few of these pieces and see where we might have some opportunities. So for start, with the processing and packaging, there's probably two main opportunities here to reduce sodium in products that are purchased for serving in food service. So this could be in the form of new products, or it could be reformulation of existing products. Now, they both obviously have their challenges, but there's some pretty good opportunities there, and we've actually seen some good successes. You're going to hear a little bit about one later in the agenda today. But there are some opportunities to reduce sodium in products that exist today that are already in use, as well as introducing new products that might just naturally be lower in sodium or could be formulated to be lower in sodium. Now, where we've seen a few challenges is that, there continue to be supply chain disruptions for manufacturers, so on the ingredients that they're able to source. So that has the potential for some challenge there. Another one is that the customer base for producers in the food service industry, it's a different base. So they're not selling directly to customers, they're selling to companies like ours who are purchasing products and then putting them into a food service establishment that will eventually get to a customer. So, they have large buyers, so, purchasing tremendous volume, and they don't always necessarily all agree on what it is that they want. So a lot of these products are actually made to spec for particular customers or companies. And if they're inconsistent, it can be a challenge. Now, I think there's great opportunity for a little bit of agreement. We actually did something around this a few years back around reducing sodium in certain products where many of the larger companies were in agreement on wanting to lower sodium. So I think while it's a challenge, it has the potential to also be an opportunity there if we can get some alignment. So we'll move on to the next piece here, getting to distribution and then into the hands of the chefs. Because at the end of the day, in food service, the chef is the star here, right? So they're the ones who are going to prepare the food that the guests will eventually eat. So starting with things like purchasing standards. So an opportunity to reduce sodium across the board is to look at, what are your standards when it comes to the products you buy as an organization? So if you currently work within a food service company, looking at what are those purchasing standards? What are you telling your vendors that you want when you're buying new products? And can you have sodium be part of that conversation? If you're looking to, from a public health standpoint, influence the food service industry in terms of sodium, having that conversation around, do you have purchasing standards? Can we offer some suggestions from a nutrition standpoint to adjust those standards to really help reduce the sodium? Because that kind of is a high level conversation that can happen. Recipes, training, these are important, right? So the food needs to be prepared in a way. Most food service companies are not buying product that is then being directly served to a guest. There's some instance of that, but most of the product is being prepared in some way on site. So there may be a need for recipe reformulation. So during that process, do you have an opportunity to say, can we lower sodium here? So recipe development is a key opportunity. If you are not, like I said, working within the food industry, but looking to help support this, can you support with recipe development? Do you have some great recipes that you can share that can really help bring sodium down for the recipes that are being served? With that, there may be a need for training. So training is key, right? You have to have great people if you're going to have great food served at the end of the day. And you need to provide them the resources they need to do that job well. So is there training that can be done for culinary staff to know how to prepare food that is delicious, that all so looking at, can there be culinary trainings both in culinary schools, but also after in the form of continuing education or internal company training? So we have a variety of trainings that we offer to our chefs and our food service staff on varying topics around nutrition, around healthy food preparation, around how to, make sure you're getting a lot of flavor with less sodium. So those are opportunities to really influence the sodium in the food that's being served. Another opportunity is around menu strategy, which probably sounds a lot like recipes, but not necessarily. So I think, you saw the tremendous number of categories that the FDA has for the targets. And that's because some food is just going to be higher in sodium than others, certain food categories. So can you look at your menu and say, all right, people don't necessarily just eat one item, right? They're going to eat multiple items. Can you mix and match the way you assemble your menu so that if you have an item that might be naturally higher in sodium because of however the way it's prepared or certain sauces, can you pair that with another item that might be lower in sodium? So things like, adding more vegetables or whole grains to maybe a higher sodium center of plate item. If you mix and match, the end result can be lower sodium for the whole meal without necessarily fundamentally altering certain recipes or menu items that you might serve. So the end result being lower sodium for the person eating it, but not necessarily shifting particular items beyond the point where they would be delicious. And then marketing. So at the end of the day, I know we said outside the home, there's less control. We can prepare amazing food that is low in sodium, but if no one eats it, then it really hasn't accomplished the goal that we're looking to achieve. So we really need to celebrate and get people excited about better for you items that include items that have been lowered in sodium. So knowing that you need to commit some marketing effort and some merchandising effort to say, these foods are delicious, you need to try them, because the customer still will need to choose them. In almost every case outside the home, they need to make that food choice. And so, looking at how can you make these foods before they choose them appear as though they're going to be delicious choices that happen to also be lower in sodium. This area is not without its challenges. It's still a stressful time for many in the food service industry, where obviously it's getting better like everyone, but still we're still having a few challenges, and these will impact how successful we might be in lowering sodium. So distribution and stocking limitations. I mentioned the chefs aren't walking into a grocery store with 10,000 items on the shelf to choose from. They're choosing from distributors who will have stocking limitations around how many different products they will stock. So you're not going to see 75 different salad dressings available for them to choose from. It may be 10, it may be 15. So they're going to have some limitations there. And these products need to be utilized enough to justify taking up that space in that distribution center. So that can be a limitation. It's not a hard limitation. It's not something that's going to stop us dead in our tracks, but it's a consideration. We can't just source an unlimited number of products in the food service supply chain. The other one is staffing. And this is, I think everyone is suffering from this a bit, but staffing limitations in food service can tend to shift an operation to less from scratch cooking and more reliance on things that have been prepared in some way. And so it's important to understand that. Now, this is not the case everywhere. There are many places that are very well staffed. We've been very lucky. But you may, if you're working with a food service operation on reducing their sodium, understanding where they stand with staffing is important, because one way to really lose someone is to go and say, oh, I've got it. I know how I can fix this. Just start preparing this entirely from scratch. And then you find out that the chef is washing dishes and, planning catering events and doing all these other things because they're short staffed, and you just ask them to do something that will add hours to their day. So that's going to fall on deaf ears. So understanding where they stand with staffing, I think, is important. So just some other thoughts on the consumer perception here. So I said at the end of the day, the guest needs to choose, right? So somebody needs to make that choice that is the food they want. So it's important to understand their mindset when they're eating away from home. And so Data Central has some great information on consumer mindset around eating away from home and eating healthy when they're away from home. So I think it's important to consider that people aren't necessarily always going for healthy top of mind when they're going out to eat. They want delicious, they want convenient, they want it to meet what their cost expectations are. So these foods that we're shifting, or we're looking for these changes, need to meet those as well, or that guest is going to walk out the door and into a place that will meet those needs. So I think it's important to understand that, they may see eating out as a treat or being indulgent and not the time they're trying to be healthier. So does that mean we can't lower sodium? We can't offer healthy foods? No. It means we need to lead with, this is delicious. This is, going to be an experience for you. You're going to enjoy this. Not necessarily lead every time with the message of, hey, try my new low sodium food. That may not resonate with every one of your guests. So I think understanding that and understanding where the guest is coming from is really important. And with that, I'll finish with just a statement that I think everyone is interested in reducing sodium for all of the reasons that have already been discussed, us included. But it's important to remember that unless you're serving something delicious that someone wants to eat, a low sodium food that sits there uneaten has not actually accomplished anything in the interest of public health. So let's find a way to get some delicious reduced sodium foods to meet our targets. I think that's all I have for you. Turning it back over to Trish.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Already sodium reduction was quite challenging in packaged foods, and we just heard about the additional layers of complexity of reducing sodium across the food service sector. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker today will be Pam Smith. Pam is an internationally known registered dietitian, food service industry culinary consultant, TV and radio host, and best-selling author, spice and flavor coach, and the creator of the Smart Weight strategy through which thousands of people have won back their health and energy. As founding principal and CEO of Shaping America's Plate, Pam has provided wellness and menu coaching to professional, corporate, and life athletes. She creates menus and recipes with a focus on delicious and nutritious offerings for some of America's leading restaurants, and was co-creator of the Bahama Breeze and Seasons 52 restaurants. She co-chairs the Culinary Institute of America's Healthy Menus R&D Collaborative, and is an expert resource for commodity brands and innovative food brands, and has been the festival host and EMC for the entire 24 years of Disney's Epcot International Food and Wine Festival culinary events. Please welcome Pam Smith.
Thank you so much, Trish, and thank you to all of you. A pleasure that you were able to join us this afternoon, and I'm so excited to kind of take the baton another way, and that is to talk about some of the efforts that have been going on for a good number of years, way ahead of the new guidance that we're discussing today, because as was said, this isn't new. Certainly the industry has been dealing with the focus on how do we keep flavor high, as Jennifer just discussed, while at the same time being able to back out some of the excess sodium that's in our dishes. That very desire, that very mission was what really triggered the mindset for forming something called the Healthy Menus R&D Collaborative, which is a strategic initiative of the Culinary Institute of America. And as you just heard from Trish, I have the blessing, the honor of being a co-chair for that for too many years to confess. And so today we're going to talk about some of our efforts, the HMC, as we call ourselves, Healthy Menus R&D Collaborative, the efforts that we've made, the successes that we've had to be able to see these measures of flavor first, flavor boosting beyond salt, tasting success beyond salt. How do we look to culinary solutions, delicious solutions, for not only this changing appetite, but definitively the changing need that is in play. So let's get started and take a look at that, if I can get my slides to progress. To give you an idea of some of our operator members, we have large volume food service. We have an opportunity, I'll go back with that. We have an opportunity to touch so many people every day. And we came together believing that small impacts could have huge changes when you have the kind of companies. Many of our operator members are on the webinar today. You just heard from Compass, but we have just a myriad of colleges and universities, casual dining, quick serve, casual dining, touching all different sectors of the food service landscape. Small changes, yes, huge impact. As members, we serve 38 million meals a day. 38 million meals. Small changes can have huge impact when it comes to health. Again, we started the HMC really with the notion that if we were going to be able to make those kinds of changes that would indeed impact the public health landscape, we needed to get out of the competitive place where, you know, where arms are crossed and we're keeping the secret sauce a secret, and instead look towards how do we still keep proprietary information where it should be proprietary, but at the same time collaborate. Those issues that we needed to be in the trenches, making the healthy difference, were things that we could discover together. We could enter a collaborative strategic process. We came together in January 2010, a few moons ago, ended up deciding that, it was worthwhile to see could major competitors really be willing to collaborate. We came together for our first meeting at the end of that year, and by just determining what our need was for a charter and a purpose and a vision, and identifying that sodium reduction, while at the same time increasing use of produce on the plate, really needed to be our top priority. And with that, those competitive walls started to drop, because indeed we needed to work together on all levels to be able to have a strategic process in play that again could move the needle. We had lots of challenges to identify. We needed to gather information and expertise, learning about what some of our sodium reduction strategies should be. How about different types of salts? How about different, beyond just the shape or the crystal size of salt, the differences of sea salt, the differences with potassium salt. Again, looking for ways to enhance flavor without focusing on just sodium chloride, but yet also recognizing all of the different functions of salt. It's not just about flavor. It's also about function of the dish itself. It's mold inhibition. It's the impact that it has in bakery. There's so many aspects to it. All of those had to be taken into consideration. And we needed to experiment. We needed to find some company-specific solutions, but then take them back to our companies, take them back to our brands to be able to identify, yes, solutions that were operable solutions. We needed to be able to evaluate and measure their success, but once measuring them, share those successes and challenges. Our timeline started in 2010 as the Healthy Menus R&D Collaborative, and there was a lot going on in the world landscape, not just to mention the public health landscape. We also had meat prices that were soaring. We had climate concerns that were coming into focus. Not so different than in 2023. It was actually out of that focus and that desire to find some solutions that we looked to mushrooms as an answer to be able to create a solution that could bring out so much umami, but at the same time reducing some meat, that we came up with something called the blended burger. By swapping out some of the protein for mushrooms, we could accomplish much. Great flavor, lowering the amount of animal protein that was being used, a win-win-win all the way around. We did testing, we did sensory testing, and again, that has continued now for many years. One of, we consider, our great successes. We have done a lot of research of our members, and even after just 2 years of coming together, we were able to identify sodium reduction strategy that our operator member companies were employing. And first off, 96% flavor development that didn't rely on sodium. Again, the US and maybe UK are some of the few countries in the world that tended to rely on salt and fat as our cheap and easy flavor lifters. But how did we look beyond that? Looking to vegetable and fruit ingredients, looking to preparation techniques, looking for global cuisines that didn't rely on just salt and fat to make the flavor difference. We knew that our manufacturers and suppliers would have to be involved, as I mentioned earlier, looking at different salt varieties and portion size. Sometimes one of the easiest way to cut your sodium in half in a particular menu item is to cut the portion in half. The more calories in a dish, generally the higher in sodium it will be because of that portion alone. Lots of strategies that ended up coming into a good amount of not only testing and experimentation, but culinary solutions. What we knew is that we needed to achieve balance. All of culinary is all about flavor. That's what, as we just heard from Jennifer, people are looking for when it comes to dishes. Yes, many are interested in health, and thank goodness it's a growing number. The health seeker is starting to overtake that health skeptic. But we still have a lot in the middle, what we call the messy middle, or the health schizophrenic. It's the one that has a good intention of what they want to do, but they go into a restaurant and yes, celebration, indulgence might be in place. What they want is a meal that's just delicious. If we can make it delicious wellness, all the better, but it's all about achieving balance. We developed something called the flavor model, and actually it's what many of us use and many that are on this call in our everyday menu R&D, everyday culinary innovation. It's looking at the fact that quality ingredients make a big difference. Having a fruit that is ripe and delicious doesn't require as much added kinds of sodium when that's used in a dish because it carries its own. It helps when you're using that quality ingredient. You can use sometimes less of it, quality over quantity. Spices and aromatics, again, that go beyond just salt. Sweet and sour balance. Again, what is the difference of a commercial kitchen versus the home kitchen is that focus on getting the acidic balance, using lemon and lime, other citruses, using wines and vinegars to be able to achieve that kind of balance. Technique and texture, again, the texture of food, the look of food, how we roast versus just steam. It helps to coax out some of that umami. And when it comes to salt, not necessarily leaving it out, but using it strategically, looking at when to salt, how to salt. Again, knowing that the surface area of an item is where you're going to get the most salt bang for the taste buck, if you will. Again, we all know that oftentimes a burger with its triple layering of high sodium ingredients is really higher in sodium oftentimes than the French fry, but the French fry tastes saltier because it's that surface area. Knowing when to salt, strategically salt, is what makes that difference. We look to pantry flavors. What is in our pantries? Again, I've mentioned some of them already, spices and herbs and the aromatics, mushrooms. Again, the ultimate umami lifter because of the glutamates that are within it, much like MSG, gives that opportunity to lift the flavor of whatever's there, requiring less salt to be used. Heat and smoke in our foods, knowing that citrus and vinegars, as I mentioned the acids before, even some things like tomatoes, tomato products, pomegranate, again, items that can make a tremendous difference for being able to elevate the whole taste experience. Fermentation, many of us have had great success with, knowing that if we caramelize spices, toast nuts, again, smoking, roasting, grilling, it just brings out that umami. And I would say this is our overall premise and focus. It's not about what food has. It is about what food has, not what it doesn't have. I think that as we've seen health and wellness evolve through these last few decades, we've certainly seen it come from that health and wellness 1.0, which was all about removing the salt, the sugar, the fat, the calories. But again, what it was left with for so many people was food that just didn't have flavor, that didn't have crave, that didn't drive preference. Today, the culinary community is looking at how do we focus on what to put into food rather than only what to take out. And in the process of that, we indeed have found great success of backing out all of those objectionables, the salt, the sugars, the fats, but it's left with just that whole eating experience and flavor. Again, umami, the ultimate thing that we're all trying to look for. We've had real world impact. Again, we've way back in the day, goodness, almost a decade ago, one of our operator members, Pizza Hut, silently rolled out a crust with less sodium. They rolled out some meatballs that were done with that blend of mushrooms and meat that we mentioned, not only able to achieve less calories and less fat, significantly less, but also about half the sodium of that traditional meatball they would have used. Harvard University made a really sweeping move with what they were doing with their sodium content of their food, feeding over 25,000 students a day. Nonetheless, just by changing the type of salt, the crystal of the salt, they were able to see a significant reduction. They employed a different salt many of you use, Diamond Crystal, which per volume has a significant lower sodium level. It's just a third of what we would see with classic iodized salt. Just another sodium success story. We recently did an experiment showing how we could make a simple tomato sauce. And by simply leaving out the sodium, leaving out the salt, only having the sodium that's naturally found in vegetables like onions and garlic and celery, which there is some natural sodium there, using a quality tomato that is, again, naturally lower in sodium without the added sodium, we could have a really delicious, delicious tomato sauce, getting only about 38 milligrams of sodium in a half a cup. The commercial tomato sauce, and again, no focus on any specific one, but generally traditional commercial tomato sauces have 470 to 520 milligrams of sodium. We took that simple marinara, that recipe I just showed, and just added 1.5 teaspoons of the Diamond Crystal kosher salt for an entire quart. And in that, we saw an increase of just up to 249 milligrams of sodium, really well over half what we'd see in a commercial one. But then we took it through a number of different tests, adding potassium salt, a buffered one that would help to block some of the bitterness. We used yeast extracts. We used MSG, which again is not public enemy number one, although the public still is confused about it. We used a mushroom powder blend for that boost of umami. We actually used roasted ground mushrooms, and then a surprise to many, almost a secret move, we used a little bit of ponzu, again, a citrus flavored soy, and a little bit of pomegranate concentrate. Again, you would never think about those being used in a marinara, but what it was doing was it was flavoring the food rather than simply salting it. And that's always our goal. What we found was we were able to provide at least a 36% reduction in sodium, even more based on what that solution was, that gave us all a tremendous confidence that there are ways to look for sodium reduction beyond salt. Flavor boosting beyond salt is our ultimate goal. And we do have a lot of resources available, one of them being this, which is Tasting Success with Cutting Salt, that chronicles that journey, the path of how to take a difficult situation, and that is to change, especially with all of the pressures that are on the food service industry right now, many that have already been identified, the triple whammy of labor shortages and inflation and continued supply chain disruption. Again, spotty recovery is going. Many of you that are from the food service sector know that many were just getting into putting menu labeling in play right when the pandemic hit. So trying to rise up and recover from that in the face of all of those challenges that are there is, yes, difficult, yet we know that the path is clear and the path is very sure. We have some hopes. The Healthy Menus R&D Collaborative is always looking for more R&D, more partnership, not just from others in the food service realm that are actually operators, but also from the manufacturing segment. We need ways to be able to get less sodium. We need ways to be able to have those products have that equivalent flavor and experience. And right now, cost is obviously always a focus, but probably now more than ever. How do we do that in a large enough sweeping way to be able to control those costs? We treasure the partnership with public health. Advocates such as what we're doing today, understanding that it's going to help us all if we can be in that conversation about successes and challenges. Again, seeking agreement for balance on the menu. Again, how do we level the playing field? Media, somehow we need to rally, and if anyone has the big idea of how they get media to embrace and showcase healthy eating as cool, foods that indeed are based on delicious wellness are cool. It's the right thing to do. And that goes right over into our culinary programs as well, teaching that strategic salting rather than gratuitous salting. How do we get the flavor without just adding salt? It's not something that happens on its own by any means, but it's been a pleasure to at least kickstart it here with you all today. So our story of the Healthy Menus R&D Collaborative started in 2010, and as you see, is going strong today in 2023. And to those that are operator members or those that are our corporate members that are joining us today, we thank you for that, because we really do see that collaboration is the path to success. And with that, Trish, I turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Pam. I really think your presentation highlighted the different approaches to sodium reduction that those in the food service and commercial food service and restaurants need to employ for fresh food that is very different than maybe some of the techniques that are employed for sodium reduction in packaged food. So thank you very much for that. I want to take this time now to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Amy Lowe. Amy from General Mills. Amy is an associate principal scientist in the General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition, which integrates nutrition science, regulatory and policy expertise, and communications to deliver strategic innovation in health and nutrition for General Mills businesses globally. Amy supports the global scientific and regulatory affairs team on topics related to food and nutrition policy and regulation, including, among others, FDA's sodium guidance, the Healthy Proposed Rule, and global front of pack labeling. During Amy's career at General Mills, she has supported nutrition and health initiatives on many business teams, including Big G Cereals, Yoplait, Progresso, Nature Valley, and has worked with the U.S. School Feeding and WIC programs. Amy received her bachelor's degree in dietetics from the University of Kentucky and master's degree in human nutrition from Michigan State University. Please welcome Amy.
Well, thanks so much, Trish, for that really nice introduction. And thanks again to IFANS for their leadership in putting together this really relevant and timely cross-functional webinar. I'm really pleased today to provide, if you will, a little bit of a peek behind the curtain of how industry approaches sodium reduction. And I'm going to give a case study and share a case study of some recently introduced food service biscuits in our school food service setting. And as Jennifer mentioned, there's a couple of ways to approach from a food industry standpoint sodium reduction. There's formulation of a new product to meet specific standards, and then there's reformulation of an existing product. And this project was a reformulation, if you will. But before we get into those specifics, let's just step back a bit and talk about why we did this. Why did the R&D team decide to try to reduce sodium in our popular K-12 biscuits? Well, it was pretty simple, really. There was a customer and a business need. Our school food service operators were struggling to incorporate biscuits, which students love. They're easy to serve. They can work on just the tray line or the grab and go menus. They were struggling to incorporate them into the menu and still meet the new USDA weekly sodium targets that are now in place for school meals. And so, you know, we were really having a business challenge to try to help them. In addition to that, these biscuits were also sold in some other channels. They were mainly for schools, but also sold in other channels. So there were those considerations to take into account as well. And just for a bit more background, USDA has proposed 2 sodium reductions for breakfast and also 3 sodium reductions for lunch. And I just have given at the table here an overview of the school breakfast weekly sodium limits. Right now, the standards went into play in July of 2022, and you can see for different grades, there are different sodium weekly targets that range from 540 for grades K through 5 to 640 milligrams for the high school grades. And these are weekly limits that operators have to meet on average over a week. Then in July of 2025, there's an additional 10% reduction in those targets, and then an additional 10% reduction that will go into effect in July of 2027. This approach was taken by USDA so that it gives schools time to implement the changes. It gives industry time to react and develop or reformulate products as needed to help operators meet the targets, and it also gives students time to adjust to the changing taste. And these targets align with the Dietary Guideline for Americans recommendations to reduce sodium, and also, as others have talked about, FDA sodium reduction goals and targets for industry. So that was the background on this project, is we were having requests from school food service operators and a need to reduce sodium so that they could, menu our biscuits and use them. Before we get into the specifics of that project, though, just a little bit of background. I think Pam mentioned in a really nice overview how salt has many different jobs in food. Mostly we think about salt for taste, of course, but there are other really important functional jobs that sodium has. For example, leavening, which we'll talk about in a bit, it acts as an emulsifier for many foods. For example, cheese soup, you need sodium in there or salt in there to help emulsify and make that creamy cheese soup. And then corn masa also uses sodium in a process for nixtamalization. While the main job of salt is for the taste, the other important functions that in the food industry we have to deal with frequently, there's food safety considerations around water activity. There's browning reactions for flavor and color to give foods that nice flavor and color that consumers love and expect. There's important texture functions that sodium provides, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the biscuits. Fermentation, sodium is of course a key nutrient. And then there are foods with standards of identity that require certain levels of sodium, and also cultural expectations for salt and flavor. In terms of taste, for industry, in terms of trying to reduce sodium, there's several levers that we have for trying to reduce sodium from a taste standpoint. One of the easiest ones is a slow weaning of roughly 5%, and then potentially doing that successively to give consumers time to adjust to the taste. And this can be a really good first step in reducing sodium. There is a limit. You can get to a certain point, and then of course consumers will start to notice, and also other functions might start to be noticeable in terms of that reduction. But a place to start is the slow weaning approach of roughly 5%. There's also substitution salts, for example, sea salt, potassium chloride. That's a really, really nice salt substitute that we now have in our toolbox to try to reduce sodium. That does give a nice salty flavor. However, for some products, it can be metallic or bitter, so it doesn't necessarily work across the board in everything, although it is a very good substitute. There's also choline chloride, which is salty but can be very hygroscopic. If you think about how salt clumps in humid weather, this choline chloride has even more of that property. And then ammonium chloride has a salty flavor, but it also can have an ammonia odor through shelf life, which obviously can be not a bonus for consumers. And then, as Pam so nicely mentioned, there's umami flavors from MSG, yeast extracts, cheese powders, and onions and garlic, and then some flavor modifiers that industry uses to try and boost that salty taste. And those are all related to taste again. Now for biscuits. Biscuits, which was the project that the R&D team recently completed here, they are a very unique and challenging sodium reduction project because salt is coming in for different reasons and from several different ingredients. Biscuits have salt in them for taste, and they also use functional ingredients for leavening, which contributes significant sodium. In fact, the leavening ingredients in any kind of biscuit is roughly 60% of the sodium, and salt is roughly 40%. So just based on that math alone, you can see the challenge in reducing, from a functional standpoint, the leavening in biscuits. And just as a little kitchen math here, salt has about 2,360 milligrams of sodium per teaspoon, and then baking soda, which would be a common leavener that would be used in biscuits, has about 1,280 milligrams per teaspoon. Additional leaveners that are found in biscuits are sodium aluminum phosphate and sodium acid pyrophosphate. They act as the base to the baking soda base to produce the carbon dioxide that gives biscuits their nice fluffy texture and layers. And then again, 40% of the sodium in biscuits is coming just from the salt, which, you know, biscuits do have a savory flavor profile, so also important. So as our R&D team was faced with reducing sodium, these were the sort of the key places that salt was coming in for the biscuits. So now kind of the how did we do it slide. This, you know, obviously is a one-page overview of, you know, really complex and parallel path work. The overall timeline that this project took was really 16 months roughly from start to finish. They started work on this project in May of 2021 because they had a goal of July of 2022 to introduce these biscuits into the food service channel so that schools had them for their menus starting with the 2022 school year. So the way that the R&D team approached this, first of all, there were 6 unique biscuit products that were sold in schools, and of those 6 biscuits, there was 3 formulas because there was different serving weights and sizes of a few of the biscuits. So those formulas were essentially the same. So they were essentially working on 3 different recipes or formulas. The first step that the team worked on was reducing salt and maintaining flavor. It was super important that as they reduced salt that they were able to maintain the flavor. And this step essentially involves screening different levels of salt reduction, working with potassium chloride as a replacement, keeping in mind that potassium chloride is about 3 times as expensive as salt, so they had to be careful with the cost part of this, and then numerous evaluation steps to see if they were getting the flavor right. And I just want to mention that the formula work and the non-formula work, many of these steps were going on in a parallel way and in a back and forth way. So as they were doing this salt reduction work, they were actually doing taste assessments with both our internal team and then also with operators and students to make sure that the changes they were making were acceptable. The second step in the process was looking at the leaveners and working to reduce the leavening, to reduce the sodium, but at the same time maintain that important function of the leavening so that our biscuit maintained the light and fluffy texture and shelf life, et cetera, that operators expect. So for that, we worked with potassium bicarbonate to replace some of the sodium bicarbonate, not all of it. Also keeping in mind that potassium bicarbonate is quite a bit more expensive than sodium bicarbonate, and you also need to use more of this potassium bicarbonate to achieve the same functionality. So that was a balance that the team was working through. And then also numerous evaluations and assessments on when they were reducing the leavening and the salt for taste. Were they still maintaining the product size? Was the volume the same? Was the texture of the biscuit the same? The tenderness, the crumb, the flakiness, all of these things that are so important in a biscuit. The other piece of the product testing was, while this biscuit is used in schools, there were also operators that were using it outside of the school setting. So we wanted to make sure that those changes that we were making were not alienating those customers. And in addition, the biscuits in schools are used in a variety of ways. They're used in a plain, just served plain on the breakfast tray, but also as part of sandwiches, whether they're egg sandwiches, sausage sandwiches, et cetera. So we had to do testing and assessments using the biscuits in all the ways that operators were going to be using them. And then finally, we get to step 3, where we had to combine the R&D team combined the learnings from steps 1 and 2. So combining the learnings of the reduced salt formulas with the reduced leavener formulas, and working through any additional reformulation that needed to happen to optimize those. When I was working with the R&D team on this process, I asked about how many formulas did they think they worked through, and for this particular reformulation, she estimated roughly 30 formulas to arrive at the final versions. In addition, after step 3, and they had what they would consider to be formulas that would work, they had to work in the plant to make sure that they could run okay in commercialization, and also ensure to make that there was ingredients available and all the other things that need to happen to commercialize a product. Additional product testing that we did as we were in step 3 would have been also commercialization, or excuse me, shelf life, making sure that as we were preparing these new the new biscuits, that there was the baking times were still similar, that we had tolerance testing that still worked, and all of those things in the back of the house for the school food service operators that are so important to them in terms of making sure they have a successful product. And again, this process took about 16 months from start to finish. So what were the results of the 16 months of work? Well, we're really pleased to say that we did achieve significant sodium reduction. So these are the 6 products that are now in market, again, mostly in schools, but also in other channels. And you can see the sodium ranges from roughly 170 milligrams, or excuse me, the pre-reduction sodium range from 170 milligrams to roughly 420 milligrams of sodium per serving. These are different size biscuits. They range from about 1 ounce to 2.5 ounces. And then after the sodium reduction work, we reduced the sodium down to about between 150 milligrams and roughly 320 milligrams per serving. So roughly a 12 to 28% reduction in these different formulas. And we're also pleased to say that the new reformulated products meet both the restaurant FDA short-term targets as well as the packaged food targets. So that was another success line that we looked at in terms of when we were working on these biscuits. And as Jennifer mentioned, a key part of this project is also how do we tell people about these biscuits? What are the messages that we want to tell our customers? And this is from our infographic that is available online that showcases the reformulation. And you can see it's really meant to appeal to food service operators. So we talk about working with their new weekly sodium targets and how the new biscuit formulation can help them to meet the targets and still provide the biscuits that students love, and that helps to increase participation in their program. It also speaks to them about the formats, the size, and the grain options. There's a whole grain option for these biscuits, and there's frozen dough as well as baked options already available. So this was really meant to appeal to the operator and let them know that these biscuits, while they're reduced in sodium, they also still maintain all the function that they need, and that also helps to drive participation in their program. So at the end of this project, what are some of the key insights and what was the impact of all of this work? So some of the key insights that were really important as we moved this forward was around, number one, cost. The K-12 channel is extremely price sensitive. They're working with pennies in their margins in terms of how much additional costs they can absorb. And the reality is there are few ingredients that are as functional as salt and also that are cheaper than salt. So that was really a key thing that we had to balance in this initiative. Potassium chloride, as I mentioned, is more expensive than sodium chloride, and potassium bicarbonate is more expensive than sodium bicarbonate. So we were in effect increasing the cost of the biscuit. However, we did believe that while there was an increase to cost, that because the biscuits will work for the school food service operator with the new weekly targets, that the cost would be offset by an increase in sales. But it was indeed a very important business discussion that we had along the way. The other important factor was that while we had to make sure that we were reducing sodium enough, we had to be mindful that we didn't reduce it too much. Operators know the numbers, and if they saw sodium that they thought was too much reduced, they might assume that it had poor quality and taste. If we didn't reduce it enough, it would limit the opportunities they had to menu biscuits as much as they wanted to. Also, as I'd mentioned, they had to be acceptable in various applications and in various settings. So not only plain, but in sandwiches, but in the other channels where sodium reduction at this point may not be as valued, and certainly where a taste change might not be acceptable. In terms of the impact, we have had some qualitative wins from 2 large southern school districts where biscuits are really a key part of their breakfast menu. One large district converted to the new lower sodium products after seeing that the sodium reduction was not impacting taste. And another district was able to serve the biscuits now 2 times a week versus the once a week because the lower sodium allowed them to still meet the weekly sodium targets that are now required. And then good news, in the non-K-12 channels, there was no increase in customer contacts or consumer contacts, and that's good news. No news is good news. If there's complaints, people call. And we haven't lost any cases in terms of from a business standpoint. So the team truly thinks this was, totally worth all the effort and time and energy that went into this, and truly was a success story, not only for the business team and for General Mills, but for the operators and the students and for the other people that are consuming those biscuits. And I believe I'm the last presenter, so I'll end there because I think we're going to move right into the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Amy. I think your presentation really highlighted the work that goes into the reformulation of just one product. And we're looking across all of those FDA food categories and all of the products and types of foods across CPG as well as commercial food service that need to be reformulated. And it really is going to take everyone's efforts to make that happen. So we have a few more minutes and we definitely have questions from the audience. So I think we'll address some of those. Why don't we start a little bit with some information about sodium reduction in food service. So there's a couple of questions about the engagement by chefs. So are restaurant staff chefs generally amenable to creating reduced sodium recipes? Because it's one thing to have reduced sodium products that you use in recipes, but at the end of the day, then you have operators and chefs creating the recipes and serving them. So I think this is a question for Pam and Jennifer. What are your thoughts there?
I can certainly jump in and start and say that it all starts with leadership. Again, when we're talking large volume food service specifically, you kind of nailed it. It isn't just about the products that we bring in, it's also the recipes that we write. And anyone listening knows that one of the things that's been kind of followed us in recipes for years has been salt to taste, TT. Well, salt to taste doesn't work for us because tastes are very different depending on the person that's tasting. And if we're doing standardized recipes that can be consistent and high quality and also meet our menu analysis guidelines, we've got to be very specific about that. But then, as Jennifer said, the training that goes into it, it's just getting the right tools for measurement. It may be, I mean, at Seasons 52, we had shakers that 2 shakes of a spice blend gave us exactly the amount that would go into that recipe. But you have to have those tools. It really isn't just recipe, it's also process and training that process in addition to basing that recipe on items that can really add up to a delicious dish, but one that has been able to meet the targets. Jennifer, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer to the question of are chefs willing is a resounding yes. You give a chef a challenge and they will run with it. And we've seen that in our recipe development, which all starts with our chefs. So obviously we have training and programs and standards, but I know as a dietitian, my best bet to getting a delicious food that's going to be better for you is to partner with a chef. And I think the days of thinking that chefs are going to put their feet down and say, no, we're not changing things, that's past. Chefs are dealing with health issues the way everyone else is. They are as motivated to improve the health of not only themselves, but their guests. And I think they are a leader in this charge for sure.
And I think both of you have highlighted that it's not just about making delicious food anymore. We all enjoy food and we all want our food to taste good, but we all need to wear that public health hat and understand, how the food affects our health. A question related to this is also about one of the tools in the toolbox. So MSG. So MSG got a bad rap in the past. So people were taking it out of food, but I noticed that MSG is being mentioned again in terms of a tool in the toolbox to reduce sodium. Do you see that consumer perceptions are changing? And I'll say both on the Compass Group side and Amy on the CPG side. What are you hearing from consumers about MSG?
Well, I can start. I know from a CPG side, MSG is still a bit of a, I'm going to say, I think consumers aren't necessarily looking for on their labels, and because all packaged food has a label, it's easily detected if we would want to try some MSG as a way to reduce sodium. So it is a really challenging, it's a challenging place to try to find good substitute ingredients, because salt is super pantry friendly. I mean, consumers understand it. And they understand, you know, what it is when they see it on the label. That being said, MSG does provide a nice taste way to help reduce sodium. So I think that, you know, it is a challenge that we're trying to work through. And certainly for some consumers and some products, it may be an option. For other consumers and other products, they have other values that they would avoid foods with MSG.
And so I think we only have time for one more question, and there's been a lot of engagement in the question, but I think this is an important one. So how can large restaurant chains and food service management companies influence the foods that broadline distributors and large scale bread product suppliers carry to carry stock of products that have good taste but lower sodium? So what are some strategies to work with the distributors?
So I'll start on this one. I'll say I don't necessarily know, at least for our standpoint, that starting with the distributor is the place you start. I think you start with your vendor partners. So for example, Amy talked about General Mills. Like, we were super excited for the reduced sodium biscuits, right? So there's contracting with the vendors directly, and then there's making sure it gets placed in the distribution centers. So I think while there's conversations to be had with distributors, and it's certainly part of it, it's more than those two players that are having that conversation. So it's distributor, it's those who are buying, so the larger groups like ours or even the smaller ones, and then it's the vendor partners, because at the end of the day, you know, you can ask for a product to be brought in, but if that product doesn't exist, you obviously are going to struggle. And I think there's also a role for group purchasing organizations. You know, it's the day where you would have seen dietitians working in procurement, like, that seems like a crazy thing. We have dietitians working in procurement now. And so you're seeing those, I think there's a role for them as well in the group purchasing organizations.
All
Yeah.
right. Well,
It's asking the question. I was just going to add to that. It's going to your vendor partners, it's going to your suppliers, because they have to know that this is an initiative that your company is willing to invest in and pull it through their distributor, because that's the only way that we can really take advantage of it.
well, I'd just like to take the time to thank all of our presenters. We have a number of other questions, but I want to make sure that those on the webinar know how to reach out so we can direct them in the appropriate way if they have more questions. So for right now, I'd just like to say, you know, we welcome you to join us at IFINS as we connect, collaborate, and catalyze science that matters. Please join our community where science and evidence drives decision-making for all. You can reach out to me directly for any of those that had questions that didn't get answered on this webinar. You can reach out to me at tzek@ifins.org with your questions, and I will ensure they are provided to our speakers, and we get you those answers. And as we mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, so the recording will be posted on our IFINS website. And you can stay connected with us on LinkedIn, at IFINS Science, and through our website. So thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trish.